February 1944, Gustav Line, near Cassino. A bitter wind combed the hills and pressed rain flat against. The olive groves as German sentries of the 15. Panzergrenadier Division peered into a darkness that smelled of wet earth and cordite. Ghosts from yesterday's barrages. They had counted the rhythms of Allied guns for weeks and learned to live between the beats. Then the horizon flashed, white, silent for a heartbeat, and a sound deeper than thunder arrived, a pressure that seemed to fold the night into itself. The ground convulsed. In the next breath, bunkers that had shrugged off 105s and 155s simply ceased to exist, buried in geysers of clay and smoke. A runner slipped in mud that shook like a drumskin. A telephone line went slack. Men called out into the rain and heard only sliding rubble answer back. What struck them were not ordinary guns. Fifth Army had brought forward the 240mm M1 howitzer, crews would soon call it the Black Dragon, a fortress killer whose roughly 360-pound shell could reach beyond 10 miles, and in good conditions out past 25,000 yards. Fewer than 400 of these giants would be built, but one was enough to teach a lesson. Reinforced concrete had a breaking point. Through the small hours, the blows fell in measured sequence, each shock wave passing through dugout timbers and rib cages alike, until even veterans began to mark time by the pauses between craters. At first light, the rain eased, revealing embrasures slumped like broken mouths and wire swallowed by fresh craters, proof that something new had entered the war. Observers sketched revised lines on damp maps, while American engineers paced out fresh firing sites. The coming days would ask how these monsters were moved, emplaced, and fed across mountains, and how their deliberate thunder would pry open defenses from Cassino to the Rhine. The need for a fortress killer reached back to the muddy sieges of 1917-18, when American ordnance officers watched heavy siege guns pry apart German bunkers and concluded that future wars would be decided as much by who could destroy reinforced concrete as by infantry. In the late 1930s, as Europe rearmed and defensive belts thickened, U.S. Ordnance Department planners revived the concept of a super-heavy field gun, a weapon with the kinetic weight to shatter casemates, yet the mobility to be moved overland by tractors rather than permanently fixed emplacements. Design work concentrated at Watervliet Arsenal and moved to foolproof trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground between 1940 and 1943. Engineers wrestled with recoil systems, carriage strength and logistics, how to fire an enormous projectile without catastrophically punishing the mount, how to break the system down for road towing, and how to allow emplacement without specialized rail equipment. By 1943, Aberdeen's test firings were starkly convincing. Proof reports recorded the new 240mm design's capacity to penetrate over 8 feet of reinforced concrete, a finding that shifted skeptical debate into funding and production decisions. Operational thinking adjusted in turn. Instead of endless, indiscriminate barrages, planners embraced calibrated, concentrated strikes. Small numbers of enormous rounds aimed precisely to collapse an observation casemate, sever an artillery embrasure, or break a bunker's concrete spine. Reports from Monte Cassino and inspections of the Siegfried Line confirmed the strategic logic. Precision, extreme power, and forward emplacement capability would be decisive against hardened belts. Frontline crews, frank and literal, coined the gun's rough nickname, Bunker Buster. While ordnance officers accepted a deliberately limited production, run of fewer than 400 pieces because each howitzer consumed scarce steel and skilled labor. With development validated and production approved in 1943, the Army turned to the final, practical problem: how to get these enormous guns from factory floors to firing positions at the front. They called it a behemoth. In firing position, the complete 240mm M1 howitzer assembly weighed more than 32 tons, over 64,700 pounds, and its barrel alone stretched past 20 feet, a precisely bored tube forged and finished at Watervliet Arsenal to tolerances measured precisely in thousandths. Mounted behind that tube, The M1918A1 recoil mechanism combined hydraulic buffers and heavy springs to absorb forces that would have shredded lesser carriages, a technical marriage of metallurgy and brute engineering that made the enormous piece survivable in action. The projectile the M1 hurled was no ordinary ordnance, but a roughly 360-pound high-explosive shell paired with modular propellant increments that let crews tailor trajectory and energy. By selecting specific charge combinations, gunners could trade a flatter, long-range flight for a steep, plunging arc designed to smash roofs and internal casemates. In practical terms, the howitzers' tabled ranges reached into the tens of thousands of yards, giving siege planners the ability to reach deep into defensive belts without resorting to naval guns. Operating the weapon was a ritual of disciplined labor. A detachment of roughly 14 men moved with choreographed efficiency. Ammunition handlers wrestled rounds on rollers and winches. The breechman guided each heavy cartridge into the chamber. Layers and trainers set elevation and deflection with hand cranks, and engineers tended the platform and recoil gear. Pre-shot checks were exhaustive. Tube temperature, seating depth, primer fit, propellant tally, because a single mistake could wreck the carriage or the crew. Transport and emplacement multiplied the challenge. The M1 broke down into towable loads and depended on M6 high-speed tractors or equivalent prime movers to haul its parts over roads, while emplacement often required hours to level, dig, and anchor a firing base so the gun would behave predictably. But when properly sighted, the result justified the effort. A single, well-placed round produced craters and structural collapse measured in dozens of feet. Unroofing bunkers, breaking foundations, and wrecking internal floors, effects that turned hardened emplacements into ruin and left German defenders whispering names like Hohenhammer while American crews grinned at the new geometry of destruction, convinced they had promised a new way to unmake fortresses and reshape siegecraft. February 1944, Monte Cassino, Italy. Rain sheeted down the bare slopes above the Liri Valley as the Benedictine monastery loomed through cloud and smoke, its ancient stones now latticed with steel girders and firing apertures. To the men of Germany's 1st Parachute Division, Cassino had become both altar and fortress, its crypts converted into bunkers and observation posts commanding every Allied approach. For weeks, the U.S. Fifth Army's standard 155mm guns had pounded the heights. Even heavy bombers had scarred the terraces, yet the paratroopers remained, emerging after each raid to rake the valley with machine gun fire. Then, in mid-February, a new sound arrived, lower, slower, and infinitely more final. Near Mignano and Venafro, the 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions completed the 6-hour ritual of emplacing the brand-new 240mm M1 howitzers. On 15th of February, as the first aircraft of the day faded west, the order came. The opening salvo lifted dust in Cassino's courtyard before the echo reached the valley floor. Each 360-pound shell struck with the weight of a locomotive. Walls 3 feet thick folded outward. Crypt ceilings burst like clay pots. Bunkers once considered indestructible crumpled into themselves. German radio nets filled with static and disbelief. Entire platoons were erased, telephone exchanges obliterated. A surviving Fallschirmjäger officer later wrote that the bombardment felt like the mountain, itself turning against us, an elemental force that no courage could resist. For hours, the black dragons methodically dismembered the monastery. The ancient abbey, standing since 529 AD, was reduced to a landscape of splinters and smoke by evening. Controversy would follow. The ruin of a holy site weighed against the cost of the defense it shielded. But the tactical lesson was undeniable. The 240mm M1 had proven its purpose, to unmake fortresses that defied all lesser firepower. Within weeks, German staff officers along the Gustav Line circulated new directives acknowledging a grim truth. No wall, no bunker, no monastery would stand long once the fortress killers had found their range. German intelligence officers along the Gustav Line faced a puzzle wrapped in rubble. Their daily situation reports, once filled with familiar calibers, 105s, 155s, mortars, now contained bewildered entries about new Allied siege guns. Patrols dispatched to inspect the shattered strongpoints returned with fragments too massive to match any known artillery. Crater measurements were recorded with disbelief. Some pits stretched 25 feet across and 10 feet deep, their edges fused into glassy crusts by the sheer heat of detonation. Intercepted radio traffic from the 1st Parachute Division described concussions exceeding naval bombardment, and for a brief time, even the seasoned engineers of Army Group C wondered if the Allies had dragged ship guns up from Naples. A technical team was sent forward from the Wehrmacht's artillery Prüfwesen office. They examined twisted rebar, cracked concrete, and shell splinters stamped with U.S. ordnance codes. Their analysis concluded that only a projectile of 240 millimeters or greater could account for such structural obliteration. Reports moved up the chain to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, accompanied by sketches of crater geometry and density comparisons against known Allied calibers. Confirmation came within weeks. The Americans had introduced a 240-millimeter tractor-drawn howitzer with unprecedented range and precision. Orders went out to deepen overhead cover, widen spacing between bunkers, and reinforce ceilings with double layers of timber and steel, a tacit admission that the battlefield itself had changed. But for those who fought beneath the impacts, technical clarity offered no comfort. German soldiers began calling the explosions Erdbeben aus Stahl, earthquakes in steel. The low, distant rumble that preceded each salvo triggered a primitive dread. Men froze mid-sentence, hands trembling as the vibration swelled through the ground. Veterans who had endured Stalingrad confessed to panic when the American fortress guns began their work. For them, the sound alone became prophecy, the announcement of annihilation. Behind the front lines, America's industrial muscle turned a wartime idea into metal and motion. Production centered at Watervliet Arsenal in New York and at Watertown Arsenal in Massachusetts, where each 240-millimeter barrel demanded roughly 3,000 man-hours, turning, boring, heat-treating, and proof-firing steel to ordnance tolerances that allowed no slip. Forgings from Midwestern mills paired with Alice Chalmers and Bucyrus Erie equipment, prime movers, cranes, and handling gear that hauled and emplaced the parts. Assembly shops, foundries, and timber yards worked in concert. Each complete gun and carriage represented a concentrated slice of America's war economy. Accounting records placed a single 240-millimeter in a near $150,000 in 1940s dollars, equivalent to well over $2 million today, a deliberate investment for a weapon meant to break what lesser calibers could not. By mid-1944, production had delivered well over 300 howitzers, while ammunition plants, many in Pennsylvania, turned out tens of thousands of high-explosive and concrete-piercing shells to feed batteries in theater. The logistics tail was formidable. Moving a single battery required in excess of 50 vehicles when cranes, maintenance trucks, fuel trailers, ammunition haulers, and spare parts wagons were counted. Yet technical and organizational innovations narrowed the gap between factory and front. Standardized breakdowns, prefabricated anchoring kits, trained M6 tractor crews, and refined emplacement drills cut setup time sharply. Experienced engineer units could bring a gun to battery in under 4 hours, where earlier procedures had taken much longer. The industrial miracle did more than produce steel. It stitched supply, transport, and trained labor into a mobile siege force capable of keeping pace with offensive operations. But industrial output alone did not win battles. It only supplied the hammer. The final challenge, delivering that hammer intact to muddy slopes, hedgerows, and mountain roads under enemy observation, would fall to the men who moved, emplaced, and fired it at the front. Their success would hinge on coordination, timing, and unglamorous logistics. June 1944, Normandy, France. The beaches had been won, but beyond them stood the concrete labyrinth of the Atlantic Wall. At St. Lo and Cherbourg, the Allies faced bunkers built to outlast naval bombardment, casemates of 2 meters of reinforced concrete, bristling with 88s and 105s of the German 709th Infantry Division. Into this shattered country rolled the 240mm M1 howitzers of 19th Corps artillery, their barrels still marked with the dust of England. Each emplacement took hours to prepare, but once aligned and ranged, the guns spoke with a depth unlike any other sound in France. Observers in Piper Cubs hovered above the hedgerows, relaying corrections over static-filled radios. At precisely measured intervals, the Black Dragons fired, and their 360-pound shells arced inland toward Cherbourg's coastal batteries. The first direct hits folded bunker roofs like paper, collapsing observation turrets and entombing gun crews inside chambers once considered impregnable. Naval gunnery had scarred these positions. The 240s erased them. Blast overpressure snapped steel doors, and debris geysered from air vents as substructures imploded. German defenders recorded that the ground itself seemed to disintegrate, a phrase repeated in intelligence summaries after the battle. The Americans refined their technique day by day. Forward observers, calibrated propellant charges, mathematical fire tables that delivered precision within 50 yards. When St. Lo finally fell, much of its German garrison was buried under the rubble their own fortifications had become. Captured officers later told interrogators that morale had collapsed the moment the heavy shells began landing. Men refused to leave shelters even to fire. To them, the low, deliberate rhythm of the 240s was the sound of inevitability. The Atlantic Wall, once Hitler's boast of permanence, had been cracked by American industry and mathematics as much as by courage. And as Allied columns turned east toward the Siegfried Line, the fortress killers that had broken Cassino and Cherbourg prepared to test Germany's own frontier. Autumn 1944. On the German frontier, the landscape of pillboxes and dragon's teeth stretched unbroken for nearly 400 miles. The Siegfried Line, what the Germans called the West Wall, stood as the last great barrier before the Rhine. Here, the 240mm M1 howitzers reached their full maturity as siege instruments. During the bitter fighting for Aachen, and later in the soaked forests around Hürtgen, American armor and infantry ran headlong into a wall of steel and concrete that shrugged off tank shells. To crack it, they called on the fortress killers. From positions near Stolberg and Mausbach, the 991st Field Artillery Battalion and its sister units dug gun pits into cold, clay hillsides. The barrels of their M1s pointed east, barely visible behind camouflage nets, while survey crews plotted targets on sheets marked with hundreds of grid references. When the order to fire came, the first salvos landed with surgical precision. Entire pillboxes vanished in geysers of dirt and shattered concrete. An observer recorded that a single hit destroyed a 3-story command post, killing its entire garrison. The sound rolled across the hills like a collapsing sky. German reports described Der Himmel fällt in Blöcken, the sky falling in blocks. Engineers who inspected the ruins found bunkers peeled open like tin, reinforcing rods bent into knots. The devastation forced tactical adaptation. Fixed defense was untenable. Wehrmacht doctrine shifted toward mobile counterattacks and elastic retreat, an admission that static lines no longer survived American firepower. Among U.S. infantry slogging through mud and wire, the 240mm became legend. They called it their guardian angel, the distant gun that silenced machine gun nests invisible to rifles. Through sleet and snow that winter, the howitzers thundered on, paving corridors through the West Wall's wreckage. Each shell pushed the Allies one step closer to the Rhine and to the heart of Germany itself. For the men inside the Siegfried Line, the first incoming 240mm barrage was not merely noise, it was a violation of every belief they held about survival. Diaries recovered after the war record the same words again and again. We waited for the next one. The ground trembled like a living thing. Air turned solid, and light disappeared behind choking dust. In forward pillboxes near Aachen and Hürtgen, German infantrymen pressed against cold concrete walls that flexed and groaned under the impacts. The concussion alone tore eardrums and collapsed lungs even in shelters built to withstand smaller calibers. One sergeant wrote that it felt as if the earth had become hollow and was being beaten from the inside. Inside bunkers, men huddled with their helmets over their faces as ceiling dust rained down in slow, deadly snow. The massive shells buried entire squads beneath slabs of broken roof and tons of soil. Medics, crawling through the wreckage afterward, found survivors bleeding from ears and nostrils, too dazed to speak, trembling uncontrollably. What the army still called Granatenschock, shell shock, spread faster than shrapnel. Morale dissolved. Orders went unanswered because communication lines had been torn out or because no one dared leave cover. Officers attempted to rally their troops with threats of court-martial. But even hardened Panzergrenadiers wrote later that courage no longer mattered when the super-heavy American artillery began its rhythm. To Allied infantry advancing behind the bombardment, the aftermath was eerie. Positions that had spat fire minutes before now lay silent except for crackling flames and falling dust. The 240mm howitzers had done more than destroy concrete. They had destroyed faith in concrete. The illusion that the West Wall could shield its defenders vanished with every impact, leaving only fear and the endless echo of thunder beneath the earth. By late 1944, the thunder of the 240mm howitzers had become part of the rhythm of Allied advance. Their victories along the West Wall opened corridors through which the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies pushed toward the Roer River, and in November, during Operation Queen, their deep, methodical fire softened a front once thought unassailable. The guns of the 697th, 698th, and 991st Field Artillery Battalions pounded German strong points along Jülich and Düren, collapsing riverbank fortifications and silencing batteries that had held crossings for months. Each deliberate salvo shortened the infantry's deadly approach. Company commanders reported crossing zones littered with pulverized bunkers instead of active machine gun nests. For every emplacement destroyed, dozens of soldiers were spared the cost of a frontal assault. When the Rhine came into sight in March 1945, the fortress killers again took their place at the forefront. At Remagen, where a miraculous capture of the Ludendorff Bridge gave the Allies their first foothold on Germany's far bank, the 240s were brought forward to secure it. Emplaced west of the river, their long-range shells struck the eastern shore, smashing artillery pits and anti-aircraft towers that threatened the bridgehead. German counterattacks forming beyond the hills found themselves scattered before they could reach the fight. Observers watched convoys disintegrate under impacts landing miles beyond the visible front, the river crossing that might have bled. Divisions instead became a calculated engineering feat under the shelter of massive fire. General Omar Bradley later wrote that the 240mm howitzers made the impossible crossings possible. Their thunder echoed from Italy to the Rhine, proof that precision and industry could do what mass alone could not. Yet even amid triumph, officers recognized the strain. Tractors bogged in ruins, bridges collapsing under weight, supply lines stretched thin. The next generation of siege artillery, they knew, would need the same destructive authority without the burden of immobility. The 240mm M1 was a masterpiece of destructive engineering, but every ounce of its power demanded payment in effort, fuel, and time. Setting one up was an operation in itself. Survey teams leveled firing pits, engineers laid wooden mats to keep the gun from sinking, and cranes swung the barrel into its cradle with slow precision. Each movement required solid roads and patient drivers, for 60 tons of steel could not be rushed. Even when emplaced, the rate of fire rarely exceeded 1 round every 5 minutes. In static sieges, that rhythm was acceptable. In fast-moving offensives, it was a burden. During the Hürtgen campaign, heavy rain turned access roads into brown rivers, and batteries sat immobilized for days, their barrels crusted with mud, while the front shifted ahead without them. Ammunition posed another trial. Each 360-pound shell demanded its own cradle and hoist, and moving them under fire required courage as much as muscle. Trucks and cranes crept forward through darkness, guided by blackout lamps, because one lucky shell from a German mortar could ignite an entire stockpile. Yet despite these hardships, few commanders doubted the weapon's worth. The 240mm M1 had proven unmatched in siege work, destroying concrete where no tank or medium howitzer could follow. But by 1945, the nature of war itself was changing. The rapid thrusts across Germany showed that mobility, not mass, would decide the campaigns to come. American ordnance engineers took that lesson to heart. Even before victory, they began sketching designs that would mount similar firepower on tracked carriages, the post-war M53 and M55 self-propelled howitzers. The great fortress killer had done its work and taught its creed. Power alone wins battles. But only mobility sustains victory. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent, the 240mm M1 did not fade into legend overnight. A handful of batteries were retained in post-war arsenals, and by the early 1950s, the Black Dragon thundered once more, this time on the Korean peninsula. Against the granite hills and tunnel systems of the North Korean and Chinese defenses, its shells tore open positions that lighter weapons barely scarred. The lessons first written at Cassino and the Siegfried Line repeated themselves. In siege conditions, there was still no substitute for overwhelming precision and explosive mass. Yet the weapon's truest legacy emerged not in the smoke of battle but in the blueprints of the Cold War. Ordnance engineers distilled the principles learned from the 240M program: modular transport, precision fire control, interchangeable propellant charges, and concrete piercing fuses, and built them into a new generation of mobile heavy artillery. The M53 and M55 self-propelled howitzers owed their lineage to this giant, combining comparable firepower with the mobility the Black Dragon had lacked. Its influence extended even further, shaping NATO doctrines that prized accurate, concentrated counter-battery fire over sheer volume. A few surviving guns found quieter posts. Some stand today at Watervliet Arsenal at Aberdeen and in small European memorial parks, immense cold monuments to the industrial will that once shook continents. Veterans who had served beneath its barrel remembered the recoil's physical shove and the smell of burnt powder clinging to their uniforms. Those who had faced it from the other side remembered the compression of air before impact, the heartbeat of silence, then the collapse of the world around them. For both, it remained unforgettable. The 240mm M1 had proved that fortresses could die, and in doing so, it redefined the meaning of firepower for generations to come. When the guns went quiet, the world they had shattered remained: hills torn open at Cassino, forests splintered along the Siegfried Line, pillboxes cracked like eggshells. The 240mm M1 had left behind more than victory. It had carved its legacy into the landscape itself. Today, grass grows where bunkers once stood and rainwater pools in the wide craters that no plow has ever filled. Beneath the soil, rusting fragments of shell and shrapnel still rest like fossils of a mechanical storm, reminders of a time when the earth itself seemed to convulse under the weight of human invention. For those who had lived beneath that thunder, the memories never faded. German veterans wrote of nights spent waiting for the ground to move, of the silence that came after the explosions when even courage seemed exhausted. American gunners, hardened by the precision of their craft, carried home a quieter memory, a respect for the enemy who had endured their fire, and a sobering understanding of what such power meant. The 240mm howitzer was not just a machine. It was the distilled expression of an industrial age where engineering and endurance combined to decide the fate of nations. Its final roar marked the end of an era. Static walls had met their match, and the age of mobility had begun. Yet deep beneath the reclaimed earth of Italy and Germany, the echo of the Black Dragon still sleeps, mute, enduring, and eternal.